All right, so today we're going to talk about the chronology of events during this period of history. The last lecture was really about sort of the background, the ideology, the context of what is happening for America at this period of time in the world. Okay. Today we're simply going to go through the chronology of events leading up to the Spanish-American War. We'll probably get through most of the Spanish-American War and we'll finish it up next class. All right. So America had a tradition of isolationism. As a nation, we generally were not involved in the world. To a lesser degree, we were involved in things down in South America, but not to any great degree as a country. Americans traveled all over the world. They traded, were in business all over the world. But America, as a nation, really was not involved in the world. There was a whole lot going on at home that was more important. But beginning after the Civil War, we begin to emerge on the world stage. And it starts with two events that we'll talk about here on the next slide, which is the acquisition of Alaska and Midway Island. Now, you really can't call these colonialism or imperialism, and we'll talk about that why, but it's the beginnings really of America becoming much more involved in the world. By the 1890s, Grover Cleveland, the president at the time, again was expanding the role in South America, asserting the authority under the Monroe Doctrine to try to keep other powers out of there, and by extension, making it more of a trade zone for the United States and those South American countries, trying to keep the imperial powers out. And as we discussed last class, a great deal of success in that. If you look at the map, South America is the only place in the world that isn't carved up during this period of world history. And we're going to talk about Hawaii and the overthrow of the monarchy there. A very complex history. Oftentimes it is presented very simplistically as simply white businessmen overthrowing the monarchy. And it is much more complex than that. And so we're going to try to dig into it a little bit deeper and understand, number one, the importance of Hawaii and the process by which it becomes part of the United States. The short statement here is Hawaii would not be part of the United States if it was not for the Spanish-American War. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. Without the Spanish-American War, Hawaii never would have become part of the United States, or at least not become a state within the United States. So that's kind of the roadmap of where we're going to go leading into the intervention in Cuba and the Spanish-American War. Now, Midway Island was acquired in 1867. It's an uninhabited island literally in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's about the size of CTC campus. It's a tiny little island. Nobody lives there except a bunch of Goonie birds. Now, why does America want that island? Why do we want that, do you think? What's important about that island? No gold out there. Might be nice if they did. It is in the middle of the ocean if you're trading with Asia. And by 1867, we're starting to get into steamships. And it would be nice to have a place to stop, to get coal, to get water, to get a place to anchor in a storm and repair your ship, things like that. And so you really cannot call this imperialism because there's nobody there. It's just an empty rock in the middle of the ocean. Nobody owns it. And we're going to acquire it as a way station on the China trade, right? On the movement between Asia and the United States. Alaska, a little bit different. It was a colony of Russia. It was owned by Russia. Russia really claimed much of the land all the way down to California at one point. But by 1867, the Tsar wanted to get rid of Russia. They needed money, and they thought, hey, if we sell Alaska, then, we're not doing anything up there. There's only a few Russians up there. There's only a few Inuit up there. Let's just sell this off to somebody so we can get some money. Why does the United States buy it? Any ideas? Why do we buy that piece of land? Ultimately, we pay $7.2 million for it. The Secretary of State, William Seward, is roundly criticized by the American people. You see it kind of him being mocked in this cartoon here. He's criticized for just wasting $7 million buying Alaska. So why do we do it? Why do we buy Alaska, do you think? Well, if we don't buy it, somebody's going to buy it. Russia needs money. They're going to sell it to somebody. And that somebody might be another colonial power. It might be Great Britain. It might be France. Later, it might be Germany or Italy, or anybody might buy that thing. So there's a couple of reasons, I think, why we purchase Alaska. Number one, it gets rid of a colonial power. It removes Russia from the Americas. It also ensures no other colonial power is going to extend itself into the Americas. And then it also provides a bunch of islands up there that, again, might help you in terms of traveling across the Pacific Ocean. So there's a number of reasons to acquire Alaska. And as you see in this cartoon, what are the American people, or the cartoonist at least, saying we got for that $7.2 million? What are they saying we got? Well, he's saying all we got was a giant ice cube, right? That's ice tongs and a giant block of ice. So we traded $7 million for a giant block of ice. Now, how did the deal end up turning out for the United States? How did this end up turning out for us? Well, in 1899, we discovered gold up there and in the Yukon. And later we discovered oil up there. So it eventually turned out pretty well for us, although he was mocked at the time. Now, some people might say this is colonialism, but technically it's not, because Alaska comes into the United States as a territory. So what's different between a territory and a colony? What's the difference between those two? Any guesses what the difference between a territory and a colony is? Well, a territory is on a path to becoming a state. If you look at the American system, territories, once they reach a certain population, can request to become a state. Colonies are always going to be subservient. They are not on a path to becoming a state. So because Alaska comes in fully equal potentially to every other state, it doesn't make sense to call this colonialism. Now, some people might argue the people who lived there may or may not have wanted this to happen, but they were owned by the Russians, and now they have an opportunity to join a society in which they can be fully equal with everybody else rather than being subservient to a distant power. Okay, so technically and legally, there's a difference here, and you really can't call this colonialism, although sometimes you will hear people make that case. Now, the issue of Hawaii is a little more complex. Let's think about Hawaiian Islands for a little bit, though. And before we do that, let's go back and look at this map here. Okay, and you see where the Hawaiian Islands are located. The Hawaiian Islands, geologically, are the most remote inhabited lands in the world. Right? They are the most remote places with a population in the world. Now, the islands also have something that is among the best of these in the world. Anybody guess what that is? If you've been to Hawaii, maybe you've been to this location. It's among the best of these geologic features in the world. Anybody know what it is? They have some fantastic volcanoes. They have some fantastic beaches. But think back to strategic issues that we talked about last class. What's important? What geologic feature do they have that would be really important, especially during this time period? They have Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is among the best ports in the world. And where is it located? Almost in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, one of the most remote places in the world. Who would like to own that harbor, do you think? Just kind of put yourself in the mindset of people around the 1890s. Who would want to own that place? Pretty much every colonial power in the world would like to control that harbor. Because if you control that harbor, you, in essence, control the Pacific Ocean. Do you see that from this map? If you control Pearl Harbor, it's like a queen on the chessboard, right? The queen controls everything that she surveys on the chessboard. And Pearl Harbor, if you have a Navy base there, you, in essence, control the Pacific Ocean, all right? So let's keep that in mind. Now, the Hawaiian Islands were inhabited by roughly 500,000 to 1 million people at the time that the British found the islands. Okay, the Polynesians had gone out there hundreds of years earlier, and they had inhabited the islands. And by the time the British arrived, there were somewhere around 500,000 to 1 million people living on the islands. Now, that is almost the same as the population of Hawaii today. Okay, so it was a pretty heavily populated set of islands by the time the British arrived into the islands. Now, the islands were reunited into one kingdom about that time, and the British began to arrive there infrequently, but when they traveled to Hawaii, unfortunately, they brought diseases with them, just like we saw in South America when in part 1 of U.S. history, where you talk about the arrival of the Spanish. The arrival of these outsiders brought diseases, and because the Hawaiians had been essentially cut off from the world for hundreds of years, not completely, they had some connection to Polynesia, but by and large they were cut off from the world for hundreds of years. It meant they had no immunity to those diseases, and they were devastated as a result of that. And so very quickly, the majority of the Hawaiian population died off as a result of those diseases. By the 1820s, missionaries from New England began to move to Hawaii to convert the Hawaiians to Christianity. So if they're coming from New England, it means essentially it's the Puritan strain of Protestant sects. Going to Hawaii, families are moving out there in order to convert the Hawaiians to Christianity, and they had a pretty good success rate. By 1840, maybe 20,000 Hawaiians had converted to Christianity, and by that point, that is actually the majority of the remaining Hawaiians, because so many had died off due to the diseases. Now, the diseases weren't, on purpose. It's not like the British wanted to kill the Hawaiians off. It was simply a problem of not understanding how germs work, and as a result of that, this devastated Hawaiian community. And in part, that helped encourage people to change their religion, because oftentimes when a society is under intense pressure, like Hawaii was at this time, people turn away from their old gods and look for a new religion that might answer their predicament. And so that, I think, accounts for why many Hawaiians do convert. Now, Britain did not want to own the islands, but they didn't want anybody else to own the islands. So they were happy with an independent Hawaiian kingdom as long as nobody else gained control over that kingdom. And so they acted essentially as a protector of the Hawaiian independence. They would use British Navy and diplomatic power to ensure nobody else took control of the islands. Now, the United States had pretty much the same policy. We didn't want to own Hawaii, but we didn't want anybody else to own Hawaii. And what's the particular strategic problem for the United States if somebody else owns Hawaii? If, let's say, France or Britain or somebody like that took control of Hawaii, what's the problem for the United States? Well, there's not a lot of resources. They're developing a sugar industry, but in the 1840s, there's not a lot going on there. It's because it's close to the U.S. West Coast. If you controlled the Hawaiian Islands, it would be an easy step to attack the West Coast of the United States. So it's a strategic threat to the United States, and therefore, we didn't want to own the islands. We just didn't want anybody else to own the islands. So we also act as a protector of the islands. Now, in 1843, there was a crisis in which France was trying to take over the islands. And as a result of that, the king of Hawaii turned over the kingdom to the British for a couple of months. And they lowered the Hawaiian flag and raised the British flag. They renamed all their ships after British names, because under complete British control, it would ensure that the French wouldn't go into Hawaii, because if they went to Hawaii, it would mean war with Great Britain, because technically and legally, for this short period of time, Hawaii was owned by Great Britain. Now, once the crisis passed, they gave them their freedom back, and the kingdom resumed as an independent country. Now, if you look at the flag in the upper right-hand corner, what do you notice? What do you notice in that flag? Anybody notice anything about that flag in the upper corner? It's got the British flag in there. Okay, and that sort of harkens back to this history of the short period where Britain controlled the Hawaiian Islands. Again, it was a mutual consent. Hawaii turned itself over to Britain, and in return got that protection until this crisis had passed. America was also doing the same thing. And so over the next couple decades, we had signed a number of treaties with the Kingdom of Hawaii, which provided for us protecting them from outside encroachment and giving us control over Pearl Harbor. So we don't own Pearl Harbor, but we have a sort of veto over who operates in Hawaii because it's a strategic threat to us. So it's a bargain made between the two countries. We're going to give you protection, but we also can't let you, give that harbor to somebody else or let our enemies or potential enemies use that harbor. And so that had been going on for decades, this tight relationship with Hawaii. And by the 1870s, 1880s, Hawaii had developed quite a sugar industry. And so they were exporting sugar, in the primary market, obviously looking at the map, where are you going to ship that sugar to? The west coast of the United States. Has anybody ever bought a bag of sugar? There's a big company. It's called the California and Hawaii Sugar Company. If you pay attention, you look at the labels, and that harkens back to this period of time, right? That the Hawaiian sugar was exported to the west coast of the United States. Now, by the 1890s, the population of Hawaii is listed here. There were about 48,000 Hawaiians, some of them mixed, and they had rebounded somewhat in terms of population, but you can see the drastic drop from the original population. And they are almost outnumbered by foreigners in the islands. The U.S. has about 2,000 people. The French, you can see they're keeping them out of there, so there's only about 70. Can anybody look at this chart, though, and see a problem, a potential problem for the United States? Anything kind of crop up? Anything in there look a little iffy for the United States security interests? Well, there's 15,000 Chinese there. That's not really a problem, though, because China is in the midst of revolutions at this time. They're not going to go over and try and take over those islands. So that's not a big problem. But there's 12,000 Japanese laborers, mostly working in those sugar fields I talked about. But there's 12,000 Japanese. It's among the largest population of foreigners living in the islands. And Japan, if you remember to the talk in last class, Japan is expanding at this time. They have bought into all these ideals of colonialism and Mahan and the idea that you have to get some islands and control those islands. And the Japanese have been expanding in the Pacific, and they want the islands. They've been making moves on the islands. And so one of the fears by the 1890s is that the Japanese might try to take those islands. And if they tried to do it, they kind of already have an army in Hawaii, right? They have 12,000 potential soldiers that they could call on to take those islands. So it's a fear, and the Japanese are going to make some pretty strong moves throughout the 1890s, and that is a threat to the United States. So you've got to keep that strategic interest in mind here. So by the 1880s, there developed a conflict within the royal family. Many of these missionaries who had come there in the 1820s, of course, they had children. So that many of those children were born in Hawaii. And many of those children spoke Hawaiian, and many of them had married into the royal family. And so by the 1880s, the royal family is really kind of a mixture of many of these New England missionaries' descendants as well as Hawaiians. And so there's a political split within the monarchy. And this is where it gets more complex than simply white men overthrow the monarchy. There were descendants of these missionaries married into both factions within the royal family. And there's one faction that wants an absolute monarchy. And there is another faction that wants a constitutional monarchy. So what's the difference between those two? What is an absolute monarchy and what is a constitutional monarchy? And can you think of an example of those? What is a constitutional monarchy? Well, a constitutional monarchy is a monarchy. Okay, Britain is an example of a constitutional monarchy. A constitutional monarchy has limits on the power of the king or the queen. How much power does the Queen of England actually have? You know, she's the Queen of England. How much power does she actually have? What can she do? Well, she can knight people and she can wave at parades, but she really doesn't have a whole lot of power. She's a figurehead for the most part, okay? And so that is a constitution that limits her power. What can an absolute monarch do? Pretty much anything they want. If they want to chop your head off, they can chop your head off. They can do anything, all right? So there's two factions within the royal family in Hawaii. One faction would like an absolute monarchy, and there are whites married into that family or part of that faction. The other faction would like a constitutional monarchy, limits on the king or the queen, and many of those people are tied to the business interests. But there are whites and there are Hawaiians on that side as well. Okay, so this is not simply white men overthrow the king. This is whites and Hawaiians on one side, whites and Hawaiian on the other side. Okay, so you have to understand that complexity in order to understand what's going to come up next. So the king was forced to accept a constitution. Sometimes it's referred to as the Bayonet Constitution, but it was the pro-constitutional wing of the interest there that forced the king to accept a constitution. In other words, took away his absolute power and forced him to accept limitations. When he passed away, his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, did not accept this. And so she refused to accept that constitution and demanded to regain her absolute rights as queen. Again, remember, this is a political power struggle by the elites within the society. And one of the reasons for this whole thing is this issue over Queen Liliuokalani's reasserting her absolute right to rule. Now, an additional aspect of this is sugar. And I told you by this point, sugar is kind of a big business. They export it to California. But if you remember last week in the video, and I think we talked about it the week prior, in 1890, the United States had passed the McKinley Tariff, which was among the highest tariffs we had passed in our history. And one of the things that was taxed under that tariff was sugar imports. Now, what effect does the McKinley Tariff have on business in Hawaii? What do you think? What does it do to business in Hawaii when we pass the tariff on imported sugar? It's going to collapse the sugar business because nobody's going to buy Hawaiian sugar when they can buy cheaper sugar from Louisiana. All right, so it's going to kill the business. So there's that. That is also a problem after 1890 in Hawaii. And so it's in that sort of context, this political power struggle and this business issue of sugar, that a group of the pro-Constitution wing overthrow the Queen and declare a Republic of Hawaii. They also request the United States accept them into the United States. Because what's one way to get rid of that tariff? If you're part of the United States, you're no longer subject to importation tariffs, and it would solve your problem with the sugar. So everybody understand that. There's the wing that overthrows Liliuokalani wants to immediately join the United States, and it's really a business proposition. Now, here's the problem, among other things, with the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. The people who overthrow her request the American ambassador to provide help from the U.S. Navy that was in the harbor, because there were U.S. Navy ships in the harbor. They needed troops, and so they asked the U.S. ambassador, the minister, to provide sailors to help overthrow the Queen. Now, the minister had no authority to do this. He was not authorized. He was explicitly prevented from this by the President of the United States. There had been rising tensions, and he had made clear to the ambassador, you don't have the right to use American troops. But he went against that. He ordered the U.S. Navy ships to provide sailors to help overthrow the Queen. As a result of that, besides I think this guy losing his job, when the Hawaiian Republic requests to join the United States, President Grover Cleveland is very upset at the way this thing happened, and he refuses. He refuses to let the Hawaiian Islands in, and so the Hawaiian Islands are simply going to float out there in the Pacific for about a decade as a republic. Okay? So, this is a complex event. It is not a simple thing as it is usually painted if you looked at some videos on YouTube or something like that, they will normally paint it as simply white men overthrowing the Hawaiian Queen and installing this republic and so on. Just understand it's more complex than that. But regardless, Hawaii has this strategic position in the Pacific Ocean. Everybody wants it. We're going to continue to ensure or provide protection just as the British are providing protection because we don't want anybody else to own it. We don't want to own it. Grover Cleveland has made that clear. We're not going to take these islands, but we don't want anybody else to own it. And so they're just floating out there for the next couple years. In the meantime, Grover Cleveland has to deal with another issue, and that is a revolution going on down in Cuba. Cuba is the last of the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Remember, beginning 1492, Spain becomes the most powerful nation in the world, and they had a colonial system that spanned the world, covered most of the Americas, south of the United States. But by the 1890s, Spain is in decline, and they have lost every one of their colonies in America. Cuba is the last of the real colonies they have. And beginning in the 1890s, a revolution had broken out there. People are trying to overthrow Spanish rule. Now, many Americans supported this. There are a number of reasons why they supported this. Number one, what are these guys trying to do? They're trying to do the same thing we did, overthrow their colonial masters. And think back to the Monroe Doctrine. What are they doing? They are getting rid of the last of the big colonial powers out of the Americas. And so if they're successful, it's sort of the culmination of the American Revolution. So 100 years of revolution. So many Americans, from an ideological standpoint, are supportive of this revolution. There are also business interests down there because Cuba also grows sugar as well as tobacco. If Cuba is part of the Spanish colonial system, though, it makes it very difficult for American businesses to become involved in Cuba, either exporting or importing stuff into Cuba. If Cuba becomes independent, it makes it easier. And so there are business interests, there's ideological interests, there are also religious interests. There are many Protestant missionaries who would like to go down there to try and convert people to their religion. Currently, it had been, a Spanish Catholic society. They would like to go down there, but they couldn't do it under Spanish control. And the hope was, again, if there's a revolution and they're successful, maybe they can go down there. So there's a lot of reasons people are supportive of what's going on down there. But Grover Cleveland was absolutely committed to neutrality. He did not want us to get involved in that. So as an American government, we are not involved in this at all. But there are Americans who are supportive of what's going on down there. Excuse me. Now, one thing that many people claim leads to the Spanish-American War is the issue of the yellow press. Now, I had you read an article last week. Hopefully you read it about the yellow press. But just in short, what we're talking about is cheap tabloid newspapers. So you think about if you go to Heb or you go to Walmart and you're checking out at the grocery aisle and you see those cheap newspapers in the counter there with lurid headlines like, aliens stole my baby, things like that, right? That's what we're talking about, sensationalism in the press. And many people will try to accuse the yellow press of inciting us to war in Cuba and against Spain. And as you should have read in that article last week, that is absolutely not what happened. And I would just urge you to discount that completely. Can they make you a little more angry? Sure. But they don't cause us to go to war. Okay? So keep that in mind. The article I had you read related to Frederick Remington, who was an artist during this period of time, and he had been sent down by the newspaper to cover the events of this revolution going on down in Cuba. And there's a supposed conversation between Remington and his boss up in New York City, William Randolph Hearst, in which Hearst was supposed to have said, "Please remain, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Okay? You are going to hear this quote later in your life. It is used all the time. And so what is that quote implying? You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. What is the implication of that statement? What's the implication of a statement like that? You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. Well, the implication is, give me some pictures and I will rile the American people up and they will demand war in Cuba. Okay? So, in other words, propaganda. We'll make some propaganda and make people so angry they go to war. Now, here's the problem, as you should have read last week. That quote is completely made up. Never happened. But you're going to hear it later in your life. Never happened. And as I said, you can't really blame the yellow press for starting this war. That's not what happens. And we'll talk about what actually happens here in just a moment. So just discount this. You will constantly hear this in your life. There's nothing to it.